Book 3. Halzun the Snail. My spirit will stay in Afghanistan, though my soul will go to God. My last words to you, O my son and successor, are, never trust the Russians. King Abdur Rahman Khan of Afghanistan. 1. Nurhan Aliyev, Uzbek librarian. Tashkent, Uzbek SSR, Soviet Central Asia. May 24th. Just before midnight, Rin's message reached the high-frequency section of the Communications Special Service Directorate on the 4th floor of the Committee for State Security's building at No. 2 Dzerzhinsky Square, Moscow. The dusty cipher officer's eyes widened as he looked at the prefix for the second time. Classification Total, the highest rating there was. Such a signal must be communicated only to the big man himself, to Halzun, the Snail, and instantly. 1 total a year was the average. The officer lifted a red handset and alerted Highest Circle's liaison. Halzun's number was restricted. Moments later, the telephone rang in Halzun's luxurious apartment half a mile away. The Snail listened, then hung up without comment. He stood for a moment, staring straight ahead. Halzun had intuition, a sixth sense born of a lifetime in intelligence. He rang for his car, a gleaming black and silver ZIL Model 4104 monster with a 12-foot 8-inch wheelbase, the ultimate in Soviet status symbols, and 5 minutes later was in his own office on the first floor of the KGB headquarters. The red light was on above his outer door. Little short of a nuclear war would justify intrusion while that light was on. At 4 a.m., Halzun was still at his desk. He had underlined 2 lines in Rin's decoded message. Request permission to negotiate sale of coins impersonating representative of Serdar Akbar. Beside the single sheet containing the message were 3 thin files, each with a bright red stripe and a multi-digit Communist Party membership number on the cover. Over and over he turned the dossiers around in his hands, reading and rereading their contents, seeking inspiration to match the information content, assessing and reassessing his agent's suitability for the task. Finally, he made his decision, rose, and put the files away carefully in a small filing cabinet. After locking it, he attached his personal seal to the drawer, switched off the red light, and rang for his secretary. Night shift secretaries were men, and Halzun studied the expression on the ascetic face of the tall young Ukrainian who stood impassively before him. The signal which had brought the Snail into the building in the middle of the night was, he could see, already a matter of office speculation. "Take a letter, Comrade Sivilsky," said Halzun. He dictated briefly. "Send that to Tashkent immediately by air courier, and wait a moment." Swiftly he encoded an answer to Rind in Peshawar. Project authorized up to final negotiations with Arab King, but physical delivery of consignment subject to modification, as we have a superior plan and am sending representative with full powers to organize transportation phase. Halzun. It was now 5 a.m. Halzun sat for a further hour at his desk, thinking about ancient artifacts, about metallurgy, about ekranoplans, the new surface skimmers, which could transport enormous loads for great distances, the Navy's war winners. He would get in touch with the people connected with these things later in the day. His modification of Rin's plan was, he knew, a masterpiece. 2 days later, Nurhan Nurievich Aliyev, librarian and chief museum curator, sat at his desk in the mock Oriental building of the Academy of Sciences, Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, Tashkent. The title had a fine ring about it, Nurhan had thought, when he was appointed 7 years ago, in recognition of all his work in the art of ancient calligraphy. A true artist unsullied by religious superstition, the news item in Pravda Vostoka had called him at the time. Most of those who cared about the old arts, poetry, ceramics, manuscripts and miniatures, had died. After all, the revolution was 60 years ago. Or else they had been polluted by the degenerate values of the oligarchs overthrown by Marxism-Leninism. Now there was a new Uzbekistan, the most progressive of the Central Asian republics. There was a museum in Samarkand showing how miserable people's lives had been in the old days. Nurhan was 36, strongly built and almond-eyed, and intelligent. Yes, he'd made something of himself under socialism. His father had been a camel driver. Under the old regime, Nurhan too would have been a camel driver. It hadn't all been easy, though. A librarian and curator of the museum had to be a man of the pen and of the book, and a man of the desk. During the first 2 or 3 of those 7 years, Nurhan had resented the constant ideological training, the military service, and the unarmed combat, the constant testing of those abilities which the party had decided he possessed and should develop further. Ultimately, of course, he had come to understand the pattern and had fitted very comfortably into it. First, the KGB sought and found people with talent, young ones. Then they assessed them for other capacities. The latent abilities were brought out, developed, and eventually the many-sided Soviet man began to appear. They had discovered that he had one unusual and unsuspected skill, that of killing. And when this had been perfected, he had understood the real meaning of achievement, as explained by the party. Once you can do something supremely well, and you can place that at the service of the great cause, you will ache to express yourself in the correct way, the Soviet way of the party, the people, and world socialism. How true the words of the ideologists had been. He could feel the truth of it, enveloping him like a warm cloak on a cold night. The KGB did not waste people. It taught them, trained them, kept their details on file or sleeping on a computer disk, but ready nonetheless. And just a few kilometers to the south lay feudal Afghanistan, where some deluded people simply did not understand socialist reality. Until a few years ago, the place had actually been a monarchy. Now it was under a socialist government, but only Soviet expertise could tap the real potential of the people, help them modernize and form the link to the Far East, to Pakistan and India, beyond which lay the oil of Arabia and the Gulf. It should not be too hard for the fraternal helpers from the USSR who were now in the country. After all, the Afghan lingua franca, Dari, was almost exactly the same language as they spoke on the other side of the Oxus River. And Pravda Vostoka had explained, in long articles, how most Afghans were welcoming their liberation and exulting in their freedom. Today, however, on his desk was a long white envelope, the top left-hand corner emblazoned with the emblem of the Soviet Union. He read the words on it, neatly typed in capitals. Comrade Librarian Nurhan Aliyev, urgent, immediate. Below that, in smaller letters, he saw the magic words, Central Committee of the Communist Party, Uzbekskaya Sovietskaya Sotsialisticheskaya Respublika. It had come. The summons to the office of Comrade Gamedov, the first secretary. Nurhan walked across the road, deserted except for the donkeys and buses, each moving as lazily as the other in the summer heat. He climbed the steps of the massive multi-story building whose architecture he rather liked, although it had been described by a visiting Western scholar as being of the brutalist school. He showed his red-covered official propusk, internal passport, to the sentry at the door. The man saluted and directed him to the porter's window. "Comrade Aliyev, you are expected. First floor, room 191. Aliyev patted the white dust from his trouser legs and straightened his tie. In the outer office, a pretty secretary in a black dress with a large white collar, properly dressed for administrative work, led him to a large, cool room with a fan whirling in the center of the ceiling. The first secretary, a tall man with slant eyes, rose from behind his desk. "Nurhan, how nice to see you, comrade. We haven't met since cousin Halide Akhmetova's wedding. What a day that was." He fished in a box and brought out a huge Upman Havana cigar. The girl appeared with a silver tray. On it was a bottle of dry champanskoye, the very best, and 2 glasses. "Prince Golitsyn established this brand before the revolution on his estates in the Crimea," said Luty Gamedov, "and the USSR will soon be the largest champagne maker in the whole world." "It is an honor to be here, Comrade Gamedov." Aliyev was, it was true, a distant relative of the first secretary, but he hardly thought that he merited this kind of reception. "Socialist Cuban cigars are the best in the world, like our Sovietskaya ikra, or what foreigners, for some reason, call caviar," Gamedov went on. "Soon there will be nothing, even in the West, which we don't have in a better form than anyone else in the world." "Yes, Comrade First Secretary." "Oh, call me Luty, Nurhan. Anyway, in private. And don't feel too overwhelmed. I have news for you now, good news. But I am happy that today I have heard that I am finally a candidate member of the Politburo." He raised his glass. "Comrade Luty, warmest congratulations to you for a well-deserved promotion and to your continued good health and long life." "And to you, with thanks, and to the tireless toilers of the East." They drank, and the secretary brought in another chilled bottle. They must have a huge refrigerator here, Nurhan thought. His own, which he considered quite a prize, was tiny, and always breaking down. "This comes from the highest quarters," said Gamedov. He held out an envelope, large and grey, with a number stamped on it. Z/22/133S, Moscow Center. Nurhan took it. The flaps were sealed with red wax. The symbol was not the usual hammer and sickle. It looked like a Halzun, a snail. The Russians, of course, had no letter H, unlike the Central Asians, and would call it Galzun. Which was why Hamedov, there at the desk, was Gamedov to the ethnic Russians, much as the Nazi monster had to be Adolf Hitler or Hitler. And Halzun was the code name, was it his real name? Of the man at the Foundation for Traditional Arts near Moscow, for whose message he had been told to wait. Aliyev was a home sleeper. Ordinary sleepers were people sent abroad under deep cover until they were activated at a prearranged command. Nurhan, as a home sleeper, carried on a useful ordinary job in the USSR while he awaited his summons to special duty. "Ardent revolutionary greetings," said the first secretary, and stood up once more to show that the meeting was at an end. He knew that Aliyev was aching to read his instructions. The envelope did not give him much information. It contained an Aeroflot one-way ticket to Moscow and a telephone number. The enclosed note, typed on an old-fashioned manual Cyrillic machine, said only, "Telephone Halzun on arrival." Moscow 221-0762 is the number of the central switchboard of the KGB, manned around the clock. Nurhan Aliyev was on his way. The big Ilyushin IL-62 jet from Tashkent to Moscow that Thursday morning was crowded with Uzbeks hugging baskets of fruit, bundles of rugs, embroidered hats, slippers, and watermelons. One, who called himself Bayuk Shikaki, the great hunter, even had a miniature deer with him. All these things were being taken by the Uzbeks to be sold by their compatriots in the Union capital's free market stalls. It was not easy to get a permit to live permanently in Moscow, but some of them, perhaps as many as 3,000, had done it. Each one had relatives left behind in Central Asia. There was no barrier to a brief visit to Moscow. One could stay there for up to 3 days without a permit, and it was safer, much safer, to carry the merchandise oneself from the Uzbek family plot than to entrust it to the state railways. People travelling by train, or those working on one, had plenty of time on the 5-day journey to rifle its cargo. The newspapers even carried reports of whole trains disappearing into thin air. Nurhan hadn't been to Moscow before. As a good party man, he hoped people there were better socialists than his fellow Central Asians, most of whom had worked out a method of living with communism without actually embracing it. The Uzbek traders were chatting in the aircraft's gangway, lighting up while the no smoking signs were on, and showing general high spirits. He'd always felt that the Uzbeks were soft and stupid. If they'd been prepared to become nativized, more like the Russians, more of them would have been entrusted with high positions and special missions, not just rural jobs. They would have qualified for work such as the Snail had now undoubtedly prepared for Nurhan Aliyev. The Uzbeks, Nurhan reflected again, were, like the Georgians, the Azerbaijanis, and a dozen other nationalities within the Soviet Union, adapting the system to their own purposes, instead of developing into proper Soviet men as they should. He winced at the sight of his fellow countrymen, embroidered skullcaps and turbans awry, bargaining and bartering as they sat in the giant jet, a proud achievement of the revolution, of which they seemed completely uncaring. Because they had tipped the cabin crew lavishly, they thought they owned the aircraft. The banter, flashing of gold teeth, tabla playing, it was almost scandalous. They treated Aeroflot like a camel caravan, a way of transporting their smelly bundles of foodstuffs from one place to another. The cabin crew, according to the Uzbeks, had sold all the in-flight meals to speculators in Tashkent. His compatriots, however, fed Aliyev on cheese, nuts, and raisins.